The morning of June 19th, 1944, 300 miles west of Saipan, through the bridge windows of the carrier Taiho, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa watched his strike force launch into tropical skies. 430 aircraft lifting from 9 carriers, the largest Japanese carrier force assembled since Midway 2 years earlier. Ozawa's intelligence officers had briefed him thoroughly. The American fleet ahead included perhaps 7 or 8 carriers. His pilots, though less experienced than the veterans lost at Midway and in the Solomon Islands campaign, outnumbered the enemy aircraft. Land-based bombers from Guam would support the attack. The mathematics of the decisive battle finally favored Japan. Then the radio reports began arriving. Not 7 American carriers, not 8. 15 carriers stretched across the Philippine Sea. 6 were the new Essex-Class fleet carriers, each displacing 27,000 tons and carrying nearly 100 aircraft. 8 more were Independence-class light carriers. The veteran enterprise rounded out the force. Together, they deployed over 900 aircraft under the tactical command of Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher. Ozawa's 430 planes were flying toward a force more than twice their strength. The admiral stared at the revised intelligence estimate, unable to reconcile the numbers with what Japanese naval planning had predicted. In 1941, when Japan struck Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed 11 aircraft carriers. America had 7, split between 2 oceans. Japan's Kido Butai, the carrier strike force, was the most powerful naval aviation unit in the world. 3 years of war should have reduced American strength, not multiplied it beyond comprehension. Where had 15 carriers come from? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The intelligence failure began with assumptions that seemed unassailable in 1941. Aircraft carriers were the most complex warships ever built. Japan's newest fleet carrier, Shokaku, had required 3 years from keel laying to commissioning. America's Yorktown-class carriers took 3 to 4 years to complete. Britain's Illustrious class required similar timelines. These were not ships that could be mass-produced like tanks or aircraft. They were intricate floating cities requiring thousands of skilled workers, complex machinery, and years of careful construction. Japanese naval attaches in Washington had compiled detailed assessments of American shipbuilding capacity before the war. Their reports, gathered from public sources and observations of commercial shipyards, painted a picture of an industry mired in peacetime lethargy. America possessed 7 shipyards theoretically capable of building large warships. Only 2, Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia and New York Naval Shipyard in Brooklyn, had recent experience constructing aircraft carriers. Even working at maximum capacity, Japanese analysts calculated, American yards might produce 3 or 4 fleet carriers annually. This assumed perfect conditions, no material shortages, no labor problems, and immediate conversion to wartime production. The calculations made sense. Germany's experience supported them. Building the aircraft carrier Graf Zeppelin had consumed German resources for years before being abandoned incomplete. Britain, with its vast maritime tradition, was struggling to produce carriers fast enough to replace losses. Why would America, with its smaller pre-war navy and limited carrier experience, perform any better? Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had based his entire strategy on these assessments. Japan needed 18 months to 2 years to consolidate its conquests in the Pacific. American carriers lost in that period could not be replaced quickly enough to prevent Japan from establishing an impregnable defensive perimeter. The 6 American carriers in the Pacific at war's start could be whittled down through attrition. By the time American industry produced replacements, Japan's defensive positions would be unassailable. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 seemed to validate this strategy. Japan lost the light carrier Shoho, and the fleet carrier Shokaku was damaged. America lost the fleet carrier Lexington, and Yorktown was badly damaged. Both sides lost roughly equal tonnage, but Japan's industrial capacity to replace losses was far less than America's. The trade appeared unfavorable for Japan in the long term, but acceptable if it bought time to fortify the defensive perimeter. Then came Midway in June 1942, a catastrophe that shattered Japanese carrier power. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, went to the bottom in a single day. Japan lost not just the ships, but over 3,000 highly trained personnel, including essential flight deck crews, aircraft maintenance specialists, and veteran pilots, whose skills were irreplaceable. America lost Yorktown, but Enterprise and Hornet survived. The carrier balance had shifted dramatically, but Japanese naval intelligence believed time remained to rebuild. American industry still needed years to produce replacement carriers. Japan would use that time to train new air groups and complete carriers already under construction. What Japanese intelligence failed to detect was a revolution in ship construction happening in American yards. The first Essex-Class carrier, CV-9, had her keel laid on April 28, 1941, at Newport News Shipbuilding. This was 6 months before Pearl Harbor, when America was still nominally at peace. The design incorporated lessons from the Yorktown class, but scaled up significantly. 27,100 tons standard displacement compared to Yorktown's 19,800 tons. Space for 90 to 100 aircraft instead of 75. More fuel storage, better compartmentalization, heavier anti-aircraft armament, and improved radar systems. Traditional shipbuilding wisdom suggested such a large, complex vessel would take even longer to construct than the Yorktown class. Japanese estimates projected 3.5 to 4 years from keel to commissioning for a ship of Essex's size and sophistication. But American yards were implementing techniques that made peacetime construction methods obsolete. The key was standardization, combined with parallel construction methods borrowed from automotive manufacturing. Pre-war carriers were essentially custom-built. Each ship had unique features, modifications made during construction as designers refined their vision. The Essex-Class took a radically different approach. Every ship would be built to identical specifications using standardized components manufactured in multiple locations. Hull sections could be prefabricated, machinery pre-assembled, and electrical systems pre-wired before being installed in the ship. Multiple work crews could labor simultaneously on different sections instead of building sequentially from keel to deck. Newport News launched Essex on July 31, 1942, just 15 months after laying her keel. She commissioned on December 31, 1942, 20 months after construction began. This was nearly half the time required for pre-war carriers. Japanese naval intelligence, receiving reports of Essex's rapid construction through neutral observers, dismissed them as propaganda or assumed the carrier had been rushed into service incomplete, probably lacking essential equipment or suffering from construction defects. But Essex wasn't incomplete. She steamed for the Pacific in May 1943, fully equipped and operationally ready. On August 31, 1943, she led raids against Marcus Island, the first Essex-class carrier to strike at Japanese positions. Her aircraft, her systems, her crew all performed flawlessly. The rapid construction hadn't compromised capability. If anything, the standardized building methods had improved quality control by reducing the custom fabrication that introduced errors in traditional construction. And Essex was just the beginning. By the time she arrived in the Pacific, 2 more Essex-class carriers, Yorktown and Lexington, were already commissioned and working up for deployment. Bunker Hill, Wasp, Hornet, Hancock, Intrepid, Franklin, and Randolph were all under construction in various American yards. The construction timelines were accelerating as yards refined their processes. What took 20 months for Essex was shrinking to 18 months, then 16 months for later ships. Japanese intelligence officers, reviewing reports from neutral observers in American ports, struggled to reconcile what they were seeing with what their pre-war assessments had predicted. Spanish diplomats in New York reported multiple fleet carriers under construction simultaneously at New York Naval Shipyard. Swiss businessmen visiting Boston described similar scenes at Quincy's Fall River Shipyard. Portuguese observers in Philadelphia and Norfolk sent similar reports. All described massive warships in various stages of completion, far more than Japanese calculations suggested was possible. The reports were annotated with skeptical notes at Naval Intelligence Headquarters in Tokyo. Verify through additional sources. Numbers seem inflated. The institutional resistance to accepting the reality was rooted in Japanese experience. When Japan needed to expand its carrier force, it took years. Converting the battleship hulls Akagi and Kaga into carriers required extensive reconstruction spanning years. Building Soryu and Hiryu from the keel required similar timelines. The newest carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, had each taken 3 years to complete despite being high-priority projects. The idea that America could build similar vessels in 16 to 18 months seemed to violate everything Japanese naval architects understood about ship construction. Yet the evidence kept accumulating. By the end of 1943, 6 Essex-Class carriers were in service. Essex, Yorktown, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Wasp, and Hornet had all commissioned and deployed to the Pacific. Additionally, 9 Independence-class light carriers, converted from cruiser hulls, had entered service. These light carriers, though smaller and carrying fewer aircraft, still displaced 11,000 tons and operated 33 aircraft each. The transformation of American naval power in the Pacific was staggering. In January 1943, only 3 American carriers operated in the Pacific theater: Enterprise, Saratoga, and the escort carrier Long Island. By December 1943, 15 carriers served in the Pacific, with more arriving monthly. The Japanese had managed to commission only 3 carriers in the same period. The light carriers Chitose, Chiyoda, and Ryuho, all conversions of existing hulls. Japan's newest fleet carrier, Taiho, wouldn't commission until March 1944. The arithmetic of naval aviation had reversed completely. At the start of 1942, Japan possessed operational carriers, while America scrambled to maintain carrier presence with its few surviving ships. By the end of 1943, America deployed more carrier tonnage in the Pacific alone than Japan possessed worldwide, and American production showed no signs of slowing. Intelligence reports indicated that additional Essex-class carriers continued rolling out of American shipyards every 6 to 8 weeks. Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, reviewed the intelligence summaries in early 1944 with mounting alarm. The numbers defied rational explanation. If the reports were accurate, America had commissioned 10 fleet carriers and 9 light carriers in 1943 alone. This was production on a scale unprecedented in naval history. Britain and America combined had built perhaps 20 carriers total in World War I. America was now matching that in a single year. The implications for Japanese strategy were catastrophic. Every Japanese plan since Midway had assumed carrier parity could be restored through careful husbanding of resources and completion of carriers under construction. The decisive battle concept required roughly equal carrier forces to succeed. Japanese pilots would compensate for numerical inferiority through superior training and tactical skill. Land-based air power would provide additional support. But those calculations assumed America might field 8 or 9 carriers by mid-1944. The reality was nearly twice that number. Worse, the American carriers weren't just numerous, they were superbly equipped. The Essex-Class carried the new Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter, a purpose-built counter to the Japanese Zero. Where the Zero traded armor and firepower for maneuverability, the Hellcat was fast, heavily armed, and could absorb tremendous punishment. American pilots, benefiting from a systematic training pipeline that rotated combat veterans back to train new aviators, were increasingly skilled despite their relative inexperience. The carrier air groups deployed modern radar, 4-channel VHF radios for coordination, and proximity-fused anti-aircraft ammunition that dramatically improved defensive capabilities. Japanese carriers, by contrast, were operating with increasingly green air groups. The pilot training pipeline, always less robust than America's, had been devastated by combat losses in the Solomon Islands campaign. New pilots received perhaps half the flight hours their predecessors had gotten before entering combat. Many had never practiced carrier landings before deploying to operational squadrons. The aircraft they flew, while still formidable in skilled hands, were increasingly outmatched by American designs that combined firepower, armor, and performance. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was conceived as the decisive engagement that would halt American advance and force a negotiated peace. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who had replaced the late Admiral Koga as commander of the combined fleet, finalized Operation Eigo based on the principle that had guided Japanese naval thinking since Midway. Lure the American fleet into battle near Japanese bases where land-based air power could even the odds. The American invasion of Saipan in the Marianas provided the perfect opportunity. Saipan lay within range of multiple Japanese airfields. The Americans would have to commit their carriers to support the invasion. Japanese carriers and land-based aircraft would destroy the American fleet in a single crushing blow. On paper, the plan seemed viable. Admiral Ozawa commanded 9 carriers deploying 430 aircraft. Add land-based air power from Guam, Tinian, and Rota, perhaps 300 additional aircraft, and Japanese strength approached 730 planes. Intelligence estimates, still clinging to pre-war assessments despite mounting contrary evidence, suggested the American fleet included 7 to 9 carriers deploying perhaps 500 aircraft. The numbers favored Japan if land-based air coordinated effectively with the carrier strike. But when Ozawa's forces sortied from Tawi-Tawi anchorage off the northeast coast of Borneo on May 16, 1944, Japanese reconnaissance had still not accurately counted American carrier strength in the Philippine Sea. Aerial reconnaissance was limited by fuel range and the risk of revealing Japanese fleet movements. Submarine scouts had been largely neutralized by aggressive American anti-submarine warfare. Human intelligence from agents in the Pacific had dried up as American forces advanced. The Japanese were essentially flying blind into what would become the largest carrier battle in history. The truth that awaited them was terrifying in its implications. Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher aboard his flagship Lexington, comprised 15 aircraft carriers organized into 4 task groups. Task Group 58.1 included Hornet, Yorktown, Belleau-Wood, and Bataan. Task Group 58.2 fielded Bunker Hill, Wasp, Monterey, and Cabot. Task Group 58.3 deployed Enterprise, Lexington, Princeton, and San Jacinto. Task Group 58.4 brought Essex, Langley, and Cowpens. 6 of these were Essex-Class fleet carriers, each a floating city of 27,000 tons, displacing more water than Japan's newest carrier Taiho. 8 were Independence-class light carriers, smaller but still formidable. The veteran Enterprise, survivor of nearly every major carrier battle since Pearl Harbor, rounded out the force. Together, these 15 carriers deployed over 900 aircraft. More importantly, they were supported by 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers, providing anti-aircraft defense so dense that Japanese attackers described flying into walls of exploding steel. 900 aircraft versus 430, 15 carriers versus 9. The decisive battle Japan had planned required rough parity to succeed. What Ozawa faced was numerical superiority so overwhelming that tactical brilliance couldn't overcome it. American fighter direction, guided by advanced radar and coordinated through clear radio communications, vectored Hellcats to intercept Japanese strike packages 60 to 70 miles from the American carriers. The combat air patrols that should have been overwhelmed by Japanese numbers instead massacred the attacking formations. The first Japanese strike wave of 69 aircraft met an intercept force of over 200 American fighters. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer, leading Fighting Squadron 15 from Essex, spotted the Japanese formation and radioed, "Tally ho." His Hellcats tore into the enemy bombers, breaking apart their formation before they could coordinate their attack. Grumman F-6Fs from Bunker Hill, Cowpens, and Princeton joined the melee. Of the 69 Japanese aircraft in the first wave, only 27 survived to attempt attacks on the American fleet. Not one reached the carriers. American battleships and destroyers shot down most of the survivors with radar-directed anti-aircraft fire. The second Japanese strike, 109 aircraft, met the same fate. Commander David McCampbell, leading Fighting Squadron 15's 2nd Division, intercepted the strike 60 miles from the American carriers. The Hellcats shot down approximately 70 aircraft from this formation. Those that broke through the combat air patrol encountered the battleship screen's anti-aircraft fire. A handful of bombers reached the carriers, achieving near misses that caused casualties but no significant damage. Third and fourth strikes fared no better. By day's end, Japan had lost over 315 aircraft, the majority shot down by American fighters. American losses totaled approximately 30 aircraft, mostly to operational causes rather than enemy action. American pilots, overwhelmed by the target-rich environment, coined the phrase that would define the battle, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Admiral Ozawa, aboard Taiho, watched his air groups destroyed with mounting horror. Reports from returning pilots, those few who made it back, described American carrier numbers that seemed impossible. 15 carriers, perhaps more, fighters everywhere. We could not break through. The Admiral consulted his intelligence summaries, seeking some explanation for the disparity. American industrial capacity assessments compiled in 1941 predicted perhaps 4 new carriers by mid-1944. The reality was more than triple that estimate. Worse news arrived. American submarines had penetrated the Japanese screen. USS Albacore torpedoed Taiho, Ozawa's flagship. The great carrier, Japan's newest and most advanced, with an armoured flight deck that supposedly made her unsinkable, was crippled by flooding and aviation fuel vapours accumulating in improperly ventilated compartments. Hours later, a massive explosion tore through the ship as fuel vapours ignited. Taiho rolled and sank, taking half her crew with her. USS Kavala torpedoed Shokaku, the veteran carrier that had survived since Pearl Harbor. She too succumbed to internal explosions and sank with heavy loss of life. 2 fleet carriers gone, over 300 aircraft destroyed. The mobile fleet, Japan's last concentrated carrier force, had been shattered without inflicting meaningful damage on the American fleet. Ozawa transferred his flag to Zuikaku and ordered the remaining carriers to withdraw. The decisive battle had been decided, but not in Japan's favor. The overwhelming American numerical superiority had rendered Japanese tactical plans irrelevant. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Back in Tokyo, naval staff officers compiled reports of the disaster with numb disbelief. The plan had been sound. The execution had been as good as circumstances allowed. But the fundamental premise, that Japan could challenge American carrier forces with anywhere near equal numbers, had been obliterated by a production miracle Japanese intelligence had never anticipated. 17 Essex-Class carriers would commission between December 1942 and April 1945, roughly 18 months. Add the 9 Independence-class light carriers commissioned in 1943, and America had put 26 new carriers into service in less than 2 years. Japan, mobilizing every resource of its empire, commissioned 8 new carriers between January 1943 and December 1944. 3 were conversions of existing hulls. Only Taiho, sunk at Philippine Sea, represented a purpose-built modern fleet carrier comparable to the Essex-Class. The industrial disparity wasn't just significant, it was civilization-ending for Japanese naval aviation. America was building carriers at more than 3 times the rate Japan could manage, and the American carriers were individually superior to most Japanese designs. The origins of this production miracle lay not in any single innovation, but in a comprehensive transformation of American industrial methodology. Henry Kaiser's shipbuilding revolution, which had produced Liberty cargo ships in weeks rather than months, had established principles that naval shipyards adapted for carrier construction: prefabrication, standardization, parallel assembly, and systematic worker training all contributed to dramatic reductions in construction time. Newport News Shipbuilding, the lead yard for Essex-Class construction, had implemented assembly line principles never before attempted in warship construction. The shipyard had been modernized in the late 1930s with new dry docks, cranes, and manufacturing facilities. When Essex's keel was laid in April 1941, the yard already had experience building the Yorktown-class carriers and was refining processes to accelerate construction timelines. The transformation began with design standardization. Unlike pre-war carriers, where each ship incorporated modifications and improvements during construction, the Essex-class froze the basic design after CV9. Changes were minimal and carefully controlled. This allowed manufacturers across the country to produce components knowing they would fit any Essex-class hull under construction. An engine room ventilation system manufactured in Pittsburgh would install identically in a carrier being built in Newport News or Brooklyn or Philadelphia. Hull sections were prefabricated in massive manufacturing facilities, often located miles from the final assembly site. Double bottom sections might be constructed in one location, bulkheads in another, deck sections in a third. These components were built to precise specifications using jigs and templates that ensured perfect fit when assembled. Railroad flat cars transported the sections to shipyards where massive cranes positioned them on the building ways. Welders then joined the sections into a complete hull. The welding itself represented a revolution. Traditional riveted construction required skilled riveters who spent years mastering their trade. A single large warship might require hundreds of thousands of rivets, each hand-driven. Welding was faster and required less skill to perform adequately. Workers could be trained to weld hull plates in weeks rather than years. Quality control focused on ensuring proper technique and inspection rather than relying on individual craftsman expertise. Machinery installation followed similar principles. Engine rooms were essentially pre-assembled modules. Boilers, turbines, reduction gears, condensers, pumps, and piping were all fitted together in a dedicated facility. The entire engine room module was then lifted into the hull as a single unit. This eliminated the time-consuming process of installing each component individually and reduced the complexity of fitting pipes and connections in the cramped confines of a ship under construction. Electrical systems, enormously complex on a fleet carrier with hundreds of miles of wiring, were pre-installed in hull sections before assembly. Electricians worked on flat deck sections in well-lit workshops, rather than crawling through dark compartments. The wiring harnesses, switchboards, and junction boxes were all positioned and tested before the sections were even installed in the ship. This dramatically reduced installation time and improved reliability. The workforce itself underwent transformation. Pre-war shipbuilding relied on skilled tradesmen who had served lengthy apprenticeships. Wartime expansion required training workers from scratch. Shipyards established training programs that broke complex jobs into specific tasks that could be mastered quickly. A worker didn't need to understand every aspect of carrier construction. They needed to know how to weld one specific type of joint, or operate one particular crane, or install one class of component. Women entered shipyard work in unprecedented numbers. By 1943, women comprised nearly 15% of the workforce at major naval shipyards. They operated cranes, welded hull plates, installed electrical systems, and supervised construction crews. The skepticism that initially greeted female shipyard workers evaporated as productivity statistics demonstrated they performed as effectively as male workers in most roles. Some tasks, particularly detail work requiring patience and precision, saw women outperform their male counterparts. The production schedule required coordination across hundreds of suppliers. A single Essex-class carrier required thousands of different components. Engines came from Westinghouse or General Electric, boilers from Babcock and Wilcox, armor plate from Bethlehem Steel, radar systems from various electronics manufacturers, propellers from specialized foundries, aircraft catapults from specialized defense contractors. Every component had to arrive at the shipyard precisely when needed. Too early, and they cluttered the yard. Too late, and construction halted waiting for critical parts. The Maritime Commission and Navy Department established sophisticated logistics networks to manage this supply chain. Railroad schedules were coordinated to deliver components on sufficient time. Trucking companies moved materials between suppliers and shipyards. Warehouses near shipyards maintained inventory of long lead items that might cause delays if they arrived late. The entire American transportation network was mobilized to keep shipyard production lines moving. Financing the expansion required unprecedented government investment. The Essex-Class program alone cost over $600 million, roughly $9 billion in today's currency. This funded not just ship construction but shipyard expansion, tool manufacturing, worker training, and supplier development. Congress appropriated the funds with minimal debate, recognizing that carrier production was essential to victory in the Pacific. The investment paid dividends beyond the ships themselves. American industry learned mass production techniques for complex products that would revolutionize post-war manufacturing. The project management methods developed to coordinate carrier construction would influence commercial aerospace, automotive, and electronics industries for decades. The workforce training programs demonstrated that complex technical skills could be taught rapidly and effectively to people without traditional backgrounds. But in 1944, as Admiral Ozawa's shattered fleet limped back to Japan after the Philippine Sea disaster, these industrial achievements translated into a simple, brutal reality. America could replace carrier losses faster than Japan could inflict them. Even if Japanese pilots had achieved their pre-war skill levels and sunk American carriers at favorable exchange rates, American shipyards would simply build more. The tonnage war that German U-boats had lost against American merchant ship production was being replayed in the Pacific with aircraft carriers. Japanese efforts to counter American production through military action proved futile. Submarine attacks on American shipping, never as effective as German U-boat campaigns, became increasingly difficult as American anti-submarine warfare improved. Long-range bombing raids against American shipyards were beyond Japanese capability. Sabotage operations, attempted through agents infiltrated before the war, accomplished nothing. American shipyards operated under heavy security, and the FBI's counterintelligence efforts neutralized Japanese espionage networks early in the war. The few Japanese agents who managed to observe American shipyards and report back sent information that seemed fantastical to Tokyo analysts. One report from a Portuguese businessman described seeing 5 fleet carriers under construction simultaneously at Newport News in July 1943. Another, from a Spanish diplomat in New York, claimed 4 carriers were being built at Brooklyn Naval Yard at the same time. Swiss observers in Philadelphia reported similar scenes. Every report described production on a scale that defied Japanese assumptions about shipbuilding limitations. These reports were systematically discounted. Naval intelligence officers in Tokyo annotated them with dismissive comments. Obviously propaganda. Numbers inflated for morale purposes, likely counting incomplete hulls and operational ships together. The institutional refusal to accept the reports stemmed from cognitive dissonance. If the reports were accurate, every calculation about the carrier war's probable course was wrong. Better to doubt the reports than confront the implications. By September 1944, the evidence could no longer be denied. American carrier task forces operating in the Western Pacific included numbers that matched the supposedly inflated intelligence reports. Carrier raids on the Philippines in September involved 17 American carriers. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October saw the same massive carrier force supporting American amphibious operations. These weren't propaganda photos or exaggerated counts. They were operational carrier groups striking at Japanese positions with overwhelming force. Japanese naval aviation, its back broken at Philippine Sea, could not recover. The few surviving carriers lacked trained air groups to operate effectively. Most Japanese carriers sat in port, unable to sortie because they had no aircraft or pilots to embark. The carrier force that had struck Pearl Harbor and terrorized the Pacific for 6 months in 1942 had been reduced to hollow shells, expensive hulls with empty hangar decks. The final humiliation came at the Battle of Cape Engano in October 1944. Admiral Ozawa, commanding the remnants of Japan's carrier force, sortied with 4 carriers as a decoy to lure American carriers away from Leyte Gulf. The carriers Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda embarked a total of 116 aircraft between them, barely more than a single Essex-Class carrier normally operated. The mission was essentially suicide. Ozawa was to draw American attention while Japanese battleships attacked the amphibious force at Leyte. American carriers found Ozawa's force and attacked with overwhelming strength. Wave after wave of bombers and torpedo planes struck the Japanese carriers. All 4 were sunk, along with several escorting cruisers and destroyers. Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack, went down with colors flying, the end of an era in Japanese naval aviation. The sacrifice achieved nothing. American forces at Leyte defeated the battleship attack, sinking multiple capital ships and ensuring the invasion's success. After Cape Engano, Japan's carrier force ceased to exist as an operational entity. The few remaining carriers stayed in port, lacking fuel, aircraft, and trained crews. They would end the war as immobile targets for American bombers, sunk at their moorings in July 1945 when carrier raids struck the Japanese home islands. The decisive battle concept, the strategic foundation of Japanese naval thinking since the 1920s, had failed completely. Not because of tactical errors or insufficient courage, but because American industrial capacity had rendered the entire concept obsolete. The post-war analysis conducted by American naval intelligence officers interrogating captured Japanese admirals revealed the depth of the intelligence failure. Admiral Ozawa asked why Japan had committed to the Philippine Sea battle knowing American carrier strength, explained that Japanese intelligence estimates had predicted 7 to 9 American carriers would be present. Had they known the true number was 15, with more available if needed, the operation would have been reconsidered or abandoned entirely. When shown the actual construction timelines for Essex-Class carriers, Japanese naval architects expressed disbelief. 16 to 20 months from keel laying to commissioning for a 27,000-ton fleet carrier violated everything they understood about ship construction. One Japanese officer commented that such construction speeds were only possible if quality had been severely compromised. When informed that Essex-Class carriers had performed flawlessly in combat, surviving kamikaze hits that would have sunk earlier carriers, he fell silent. The interrogations revealed that Japanese pre-war intelligence on American industrial capacity had been fundamentally flawed. Naval attachés in Washington had observed peacetime American shipyards and correctly noted their relaxed pace and outdated methods. What they failed to anticipate was America's ability to transform its industrial base when mobilized for war. The same nation that seemed inefficient and complacent in peacetime became a production juggernaut when threatened. Japanese officers also failed to grasp American cultural advantages in industrial production, the willingness to train unskilled workers quickly rather than insisting on lengthy apprenticeships, the acceptance of standardization over craftsmanship, the preference for quantity over perfection, the integration of women into the industrial workforce, the decentralized manufacturing networks that mobilized suppliers across the entire country. These cultural factors, invisible to foreign observers watching peacetime shipyards, became decisive advantages in wartime production. The interrogations also revealed Japanese awareness of their industrial limitations. Officers candidly admitted that Japan could never match American production, even under ideal circumstances. Japanese steel production was perhaps 1/10 of American output. Japan's machine tool industry was far less developed. The skilled workforce was smaller. Resource constraints, particularly petroleum and rare metals, limited what could be manufactured. Japan's strategy had always relied on winning quickly before American production came fully online. What Japanese planners hadn't anticipated was how quickly American production would mobilize. The assumption that America needed 2 to 3 years to convert to wartime manufacturing proved catastrophically wrong. By mid-1943, barely 18 months after Pearl Harbor, American shipyards were producing carriers at rates Japanese analysts had thought impossible. The window for Japanese victory had closed before Japan could consolidate its conquests. The Essex-Class carriers themselves represented a watershed in naval architecture. They established templates for carrier design that influenced every subsequent American carrier. The angled flight deck, steam catapults, and optical landing systems that would define post-war carriers all evolved from lessons learned operating the Essex-Class. Several ships served into the Vietnam War after extensive modernization. USS Lexington, the last active Essex-Class carrier, didn't decommission until 1991, nearly 50 years after her original commissioning. The production achievement also influenced American defense policy for the remainder of the 20th century. The lesson that industrial capacity was the ultimate strategic weapon became foundational to Cold War planning. American military strategy emphasized maintaining industrial surge capacity that could rapidly expand production in wartime. The ability to outproduce adversaries, demonstrated so dramatically with the Essex-Class program, became a cornerstone of American defense doctrine. For Japan, the lesson was bitter but clear. The decisive battle concept, the idea that a single engagement could determine a war's outcome, was obsolete in the age of industrial warfare. When one combatant could produce weapons faster than the other could destroy them, tactical brilliance became irrelevant. The same lesson that German U-boat commanders learned watching endless convoys of American Liberty ships applied equally to Japanese admirals watching endless streams of American carriers. The human cost of this industrial disparity was staggering. Japanese naval aviators, the best-trained pilots in the world at war's start, were ground down by attrition they couldn't replace. American industrial capacity meant that for every American pilot lost, 2 or 3 were trained to replace him, flying aircraft that were improved based on combat feedback. Japanese pilots flew obsolescent aircraft with inadequate replacement pilot training, facing odds that made survival increasingly unlikely. By war's end, the transformation was complete. Japan, which began the war with the world's most powerful carrier force, ended it with no operational carriers. America, which began the war with 7 carriers split between 2 oceans, ended it with nearly 100 carriers of all types. The numerical superiority was so overwhelming that American carriers conducted operations with impunity, striking Japanese home islands repeatedly in 1945 without facing meaningful opposition. The final American carrier raid on Kure Naval Base in July 1945 demonstrated the reversal of fortunes. American carrier aircraft sank or damaged every remaining Japanese capital ship in the harbor, including the carriers Amagi, Katsuragi, and Ryuho. The surviving Japanese carriers from earlier in the war, including the battleship carriers Issei and Hyuga, were bombed into uselessness. The carriers that survived were scuttled or scrapped after Japan's surrender. When Japan formally surrendered on September 2, 1945, the ceremony took place aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The choice of a battleship over a carrier was symbolic, a nod to traditional naval power. But the victory had been won by carriers, specifically by an avalanche of Essex-Class carriers that Japanese intelligence had never imagined possible. 4 Essex-Class carriers attended the surrender ceremony: Yorktown, Ticonderoga, Hancock, and Shangri-La. Their presence was both symbolic and practical. They provided air cover for the ceremony and represented the overwhelming naval power that had defeated Japan. The carriers that Japanese admirals had dismissed as impossible had destroyed Japanese naval aviation and made surrender inevitable. The legacy extended beyond World War II. The production techniques developed for Essex-Class construction influenced American shipbuilding for generations. The project management methods, the workforce training programs, the supplier coordination networks all became templates for future large-scale manufacturing projects. When America built its first nuclear-powered carriers in the 1950s, the organizational structures owed much to lessons learned building the Essex-Class. The carriers themselves continued serving long after their original designers expected. Many underwent extensive modernization in the 1950s, receiving angled flight decks, steam catapults, and updated radar systems that allowed them to operate jet aircraft. Several served in the Korean War, providing close air support and interdiction missions that demonstrated the carrier's continuing relevance. Vietnam saw Essex-Class carriers conducting combat operations again, launching strikes against targets in North Vietnam and supporting ground operations in the south. The last Essex-Class carrier in service, USS Lexington, spent her final decades as a training carrier, qualifying thousands of naval aviators in carrier operations. She trained pilots who would fly in the Gulf War and beyond, a direct link between World War II carrier operations and modern naval aviation. When she finally decommissioned in 1991, she held the record as the longest-serving carrier in naval history. But perhaps the most significant legacy was the lesson about industrial capacity as a strategic weapon. The Essex-Class program demonstrated that in modern warfare, the nation that could produce weapons faster than they could be destroyed held an overwhelming advantage. This lesson influenced American strategic thinking throughout the Cold War and beyond. The ability to surge production, to mobilize industry for rapid weapon system manufacture, became a key measure of national power. For Japanese naval officers, the Essex-Class carriers represented a fundamental miscalculation that cost them the war. Admiral Ozawa, in his post-war memoirs, wrote candidly about the intelligence failure. We prepared to fight the American Navy we observed in peacetime. We failed to imagine the industrial mobilization they could achieve in war. By the time we understood our error, it was too late. The carriers we thought impossible had already been built, and more were coming every month. The observation captured the essence of the strategic failure. Japanese planning assumed American industrial capacity was roughly comparable to Japan's, perhaps 3 or 4 times larger, but not fundamentally different in character. The reality was that American industry, once mobilized, operated on a scale Japan couldn't match. The difference wasn't 3 or 4 times. It was closer to 10 or 15 times in practical production capacity. This disparity extended beyond carriers to every category of war material. American shipyards produced more destroyers, submarines, and cruisers than Japan could sink. American aircraft factories produced more planes than Japan could shoot down. American munitions plants produced more ammunition than Japan could expend. The industrial disparity was so overwhelming that Japanese forces were often defeated by sheer weight of materiel before American tactical or operational superiority even mattered. The final irony was that many of the techniques that made rapid Essex-Class production possible were adaptations of Japanese automotive manufacturing methods. American industrialists had studied Japanese production efficiency in the 1930s, particularly Toyota's just-in-time manufacturing and quality control processes. These methods, refined and scaled up, became part of the arsenal that defeated Japan. The student had learned from the teacher and then surpassed them. In the end, the story of the Essex-Class carriers was less about naval architecture or tactical innovation than about industrial mobilization. The ships themselves were excellent designs, but not revolutionary. What was revolutionary was building them in quantities and at speeds that defied conventional wisdom. 17 fleet carriers in 30 months represented production on a scale unprecedented in naval history and never matched since. When the last Essex-Class carrier was decommissioned in 1991, she marked the end of an era. No future carrier class would be built in such numbers. The supercarriers that followed were more capable, but far more expensive and time-consuming to build. The industrial conditions that made rapid Essex-Class production possible, the mobilized workforce, the coordinated supplier networks, the urgency of existential war would never be replicated. But the legacy remained. Every American carrier since has incorporated lessons learned from operating the Essex-Class. The organizational structures, the operational procedures, the tactical doctrines, all trace their lineage to those first wartime fleet carriers. The Essex-Class established what a modern fleet carrier should be, and that template endured through multiple generations of carrier development. For the Japanese admirals who watched in disbelief as carrier after carrier appeared in American task forces, the Essex-Class represented more than defeat. They represented the obsolescence of traditional naval thinking. The decisive battle, the concept that had guided Japanese naval strategy since the Russo-Japanese War, had been rendered meaningless by industrial capacity. When one side could build carriers faster than the other could sink them, the decisive battle became impossible. Victory went not to the side with superior tactics or training, but to the side with superior production. The 17 Essex-class carriers that appeared in the Pacific in 18 months weren't just ships. They were the physical manifestation of American industrial power, a demonstration that in modern warfare, the factory was as important as the fleet. The admirals who dismissed them as impossible had been correct in one sense. By traditional shipbuilding standards, they were impossible. But America had rewritten the standards, and by the time Japan realized what was happening, the war was already lost. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.